Welcome to Troubleshooting Innovation, a commercial baking podcast, sponsored by Lalamun Baking, a fermentation-based ingredient supplier committed to reinforcing the goodness of grain. I'm your host, Joanie Spencer, Editor-in-Chief of Commercial Baking. This season, I'm speaking with Julie Miller-Jones, a member of the Grain Foods Foundation Scientific Advisory Board, and Charlotte Martin, registered dietitian and consultant for the Grain Foods Foundation. And we are debunking bread myths to help bakers develop delicious, healthy, grain-based products and help them educate their consumers on the health benefits of bread. In this episode, we are debunking assumptions around sodium levels and processing concerns. Hi, Julie and Charlotte. Thanks so much for joining me again this week.
Yes. Thank you for having us again.
So we've had a couple of really lively discussions around a few myths, and this week we are going to tackle two more: sodium and processing. So basically, bread has baking and maybe just food in general's most basic formula: flour, water, salt, and yeast. But one of those four ingredients has a pretty bad reputation among health-conscious consumers and some medical professionals. So since you both are well versed in this, I would love to get both of your thoughts just on sodium in general. Like, where are we with sodium?
Well, unfortunately, most people in the US eat at what is called the upper level rather than what is recommended. And so some people are over 3,700 milligrams of sodium a day. The recommendation is 2,300 for those people with issues, medical issues, way down to 1,500, which is very difficult to do. And you need to use a lot of strategies. My big strategy is put the salt shaker away mostly and herb it up. Really enjoy all the flavors that can come from herbs and spices. But sodium is a problem, but it's only a problem to about a third of us. Between 20 and 30% are what we call salt sensitive. Another 10 to 20% are what we call reverse salt sensitive, in that if they don't get the sodium, they have problems. They're going for the middle by the recommendations, but there's been in the heated debates in the research community about where this should really be, because I can't look at you and say, you're sodium sensitive and you're not. And so there is this general push by the WHO and the FDA and others to try to lower our sodium intake. And the way they're trying to lower it is not to actually harm the people that actually can tolerate more salt, but to clearly approaching 4,000 milligrams a day is not good. So how can we address that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen lately this big push for everyone to eat more salt, which I think is, crazy. But as it pertains to bread, this is definitely, a common myth that it should be avoided if you're monitoring your sodium intake, because sodium and content in bread, first of all, it can vary significantly among different types and brands. And not all breads are high in sodium. So there are lower sodium options available. And most breads on average, I believe, contain between about 100 and 200 milligrams of sodium per slice. And that's well within the daily recommended limit of 2,300 milligrams if you're going to have a sandwich. So, it can definitely be part of a balanced diet if you are closely monitoring your sodium intake. And again, I know I keep saying this every episode, but it's really more about considering the overall sodium content of what you're serving bread with, usually a sandwich, right? I actually looked this up right before this, but, we tend to put the sliced deli meats you can buy at the grocery store in our sandwiches. And, some of those just for a 2-ounce serving, and nobody is sticking to just 2 ounces of something like honey ham, and you're getting 500 to 600 milligrams of sodium just in that small serving. So if you think, the average person is probably putting, double that plus other high sodium condiments, that sodium can really add up, and most of that is not even coming from the bread. So it's, again, reinforcing it's about the whole of your diet, the whole of your meals, but you can certainly include bread in the diet even if you're monitoring your sodium intake.
Even if you're at a fast food chain, you might want to think about choosing an option that isn't the super stuffed triple, double burger with the bacon and all the sauces, because that contains what the government recommends you eat in sodium. Contains about as much as they really say you should have in a day. Ask for extra tomato, ask for extra lettuce. These are very low sodium foods. So ways that you can still participate and be part of the group that's going to some of these chains, but ways to make it better for you. I tell them to give me as much tomato as they're willing to give me. But unfortunately, it's the bread that gets blamed. It's guilt by association rather than actual guilt by fact.
For sure. It makes me think you can replace the bread with a lettuce wrap and then pack a bunch of sodium packed deli meat inside the lettuce, and then you're going to be fine.
Right. And then some of the sauces are very high in sodium. So that would be something you need to really look at. And then try to get flavor by using spices and herbs. That was one of the things in when I taught beginning foods to dietitians. We would try to see how could we make this taste alluring without using a lot of salt.
Right. I kind of live by your mantra, Julie. I put the salt shaker away when I'm cooking and use spices. My mother didn't cook with salt, so I don't cook with salt. But if I bake something, I never skip the salt because I'm like, you can't change anything in a recipe when you're baking in your house because it'll change the outcome. And of course, manufactured baked goods are the same thing, and salt plays an integral role in bread production.
You can leave it out of any cake or cookie, that kind of recipe, where salt is really important in bread making. So if it's a yeast-raised product, it controls the rate at which the yeast grows. And it also controls abnormal fermentations that would give you an off flavor, perhaps even a microorganism you don't want to ingest. And so there's a base level of sodium that's needed in a yeast product, which is not needed in the biscuit and cookie kind of product. So those you can leave the sodium out, leave the salt out. And then you can look for baking powders that are calcium based, not sodium based, which helps our calcium intake. So there are ways even with the biscuit and cookie kind of product where you can come with a lower sodium product.
How do you successfully formulate to have, the lowest possible amount of sodium that you can have without impacting the product quality or the product taste? And is there a way to formulate around it? Like, can you add other health benefits to offset sodium concerns?
Many of the products may have more salt than than the level that's absolutely necessary. And that's easily available on the web, what amount you would need per 100 grams of flour or 100 pounds of what the baking industry recipe kind of use. But beyond that, it's so important in terms of what it does for the fermentation that what you want to do is work with your diet as a whole so that the things that require sodium to make it healthy and safe get the amount that is required, and then you control it by controlling the amount of sodium you add to the other foods in your diet.
And that kind of goes to Charlotte's point that we're not talking about massive amounts of sodium, that you can consume a reasonable amount of bread in a day and stay well within the recommended daily sodium intake.
I think really problematic things are, Charlotte already mentioned, some of the sandwich fillings are very high. Pizza toppings, and then the cheese with the pizza. Cheese is another thing that to make a successful cheese, you have to have the salt there. Avoiding extra cheese, trying to buy your popcorn with no salt, and then flavor it with herbs and that kind of thing, just so that you can There's a variety of strategies to address it. I think addressing it when the manufacturer goes as low as they can and still maintain a safe fermentation, I think that's the sweet spot. The myth comes from statements from the USDA that say the number one source of sodium in your diet is breads and cereals. And that's true because we eat those so frequently. Remember, I told you it was about 50% of our calories. And some of these are from foods that what I like to sort between staple grain-based foods like bread and indulgent grain-based foods, which we eat a lot of. So those are the ones that I would really encourage people to find options, such as unsalted popcorn or things that where they can have the snack, but you can do it without so much sodium.
All right. So let's go back to this very simple formula: flour, water, salt, and yeast. It's simple, but manufactured breads also get a really bad rap. And it's often around this term that consumers are picking up on, and that's ultra processed. What are you both hearing from consumers or conversations that you're having with bread producers or through GFF around these assumptions that people are making about processed bread? Is there even such a thing as finger quote ultra processed?
So yeah, this is another common myth, and I'm seeing this word ultra processed all over. But yeah, this is another common myth that bread is ultra processed and therefore bad for you. So yes, I mean, there's no denying or hiding that bread is a processed food, but the definition, I don't even really know if there's a standard definition of ultra processed food because it's not based on current scientific evidence. So unfortunately, this classification often includes foods that have been intentionally formulated and processed to have a positive impact on health. So it's important that consumers realize that this label of ultra processed doesn't inherently mean unhealthy. We really can't say that all of these are unhealthy in the same way that we can't say that all less processed foods are healthy and nutritious. Some foods undergo processing for very legitimate health conscious reasons, like ensuring safety, extending shelf life, or even contributing to the food's structure and texture. And an example of this is the role of salt in bread. It's not just about flavor, but also preservation and texture. So we just need to continuously remind consumers that bread can provide them with valuable nutrients, which are beneficial for overall health. And they just, it's important to understand the nuances of these processed foods like bread.
Well, the tragedy of the common is that a public health professional named Monteiro from Brazil, who is on the FAO-WHO board, wrote the Brazilian dietary guidelines. He and his colleagues determined the categorization, which has not been adopted by the rest of the world, which places all bread with more than 5 ingredients, by his definition, is ultra processed. Unfortunately, his definition is the one that's being used for all the research. The headlines: ultra processed food causes depression and infertility. I mean, it's just all these things. The crazy thing, which Charlotte alluded to, is that puts whole grain bread in the same category with Coca-Cola. But it's also in the same category with infant formula and things like Glucerna, which are specially formulated to help a diabetic. So his categorization makes me crazy. Nonetheless, it's what the public health people are using, and public health people from prestigious universities in this country are citing all this work and using his categorization for their research. So that's one of the problems that's promoting this myth.
I had a question for you. You said that puts whole grain bread in the same category as soda. So wouldn't the research then show, since whole grain bread is so nutritious, wouldn't that then show that ultra processed foods could have beneficial impacts on health?
Well, that's what one of the core, I talk about this a lot at conferences, and we have all kinds of data to say that people who eat whole grain bread have lower risk of everything.
Right.
I guarantee you 99 and 4,400% of that bread was not made at home. And if it's homemade, by the way, it gets a pass. No matter what you put in, you could put a pound of salt in it. So how can those two things be true at the same time? Some people are actually starting to take apart Montero's research, and they're taking it apart by showing if we take out yogurt, which also has been shown, no matter how much sugar is there, to actually have positive health impacts. If we take out those things that we know have all kinds of data to say that they're healthy, really what is left is Coke and candy and whatever. And so again, I think it's really disingenuous to put these disparate things in the same category. But anyway, that's where we're at. And that's why we get a headline a week on the evil of this ultra processed food. And unfortunately, people are not, I would say, not using critical thinking to see what is actually in those categories. And that bothers me. But that's where we're at.
And it's also unfortunate for bread manufacturers, because if we start looking at ultra processed foods by this definition or this whatever he's created, basically something having, I think you said, more than 5 ingredients, just crazy. Yeah, because a manufacturer may want to increase the nutritional quality by, adding some seeds or oats or including multiple flours, and that would discourage them.
Well, and it actually, it is so crazy that if you fortify the food.
Oh, that's an ingredient?
It is, of course, it's an additive.
Yeah, right.
It immediately makes it an ultra processed food. It's nuts. And I'm very disappointed at some of the large public health institutions that always say avoid processed food without really thinking about what they're saying. Because we can show that people who eat breakfast cereal every day have lower weights than people who don't. We have all kinds of data to say that this is not where we need to be. And so yet we have another, as you say, myth to get around. Or if we wanted to add more herbs, for instance, to avoid the sodium, then we're going to be, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Lallemand Baking is proud to sponsor this season of Troubleshooting Innovation. As a supplier to the baking industry and member of the Grain Foods Foundation, Lallemand is committed to reinforcing the goodness of grain and sharing credible sources of information to communicate the health benefits of bread.
Something I find interesting is also how the people who are often the first to complain about, how processed our food is, how processed bread is, are also the first to complain when they get like some artisan bread somewhere that ends up molding the next day.
That's right.
Processing ensures safety.
And sustainability. Just think about, you can get a bread from some companies that lasts for 10 days without molding. Think of what that saves in terms of trucks to drive it there, baking every day, ingredients to go in that. As we look to 2050, both in terms of the food supply and in terms of the environment, we have to rethink this. And that additives are not badditives.
Oh, I love that.
Additives actually extend the shelf life. And that is for people living in food deserts, for all of us in terms of living on this planet, that's really important. And it makes it cheaper. I mean, an artisan bread's $8 a loaf, and I can get one of the loaves with all the additives in it for $1.50 to $2. And so that's really important too, in terms of, I think it's a classist. I said it's a classist system and a sexist system. And it's sexist because who's going to be home making all these things from scratch? And are we all going to make them correctly? And for instance, they don't know that if you eat a raw tomato, you get more vitamin C, but if you eat a canned tomato, you get more lycopene. And so what we ought to be doing is balancing, just as we do everything else, eat some fresh, some canned or whatever, because they all do something for you.
Well, I feel like just adding that word ultra in front of it just contributes to this alarmist culture in creating this fear of manufactured foods, because what's the difference between processed and ultra processed? We hear people say so often avoid processed foods, and that's this rhetoric that gets ingrained into consumers' minds. And then you throw in ultra processed and it's like, hide your children. So then what can bakers do? But first I want to ask from a formulating and from a food science standpoint, it seems like an impossible question. Like, how do they create a healthy product that's made on a commercial scale with 5 ingredients? I mean, it's just impossible.
The minute you put it in a plastic bag, in his definition, is ultra processed. He saw the food industry come into Brazil when they used to eat more ingredients that they just raised locally and cooked. And so he thinks the food industry at large came in, and that's the reason that Brazilians are gaining weight. That's what started all this. So no, you can't. You cannot. You can make French bread with the 4 ingredients that stales every day. That is processed. But if I have a can of carrots with no salt in it, that is minimally processed under the Montero scheme. If it has salt in it or sugar in the can, it's processed. And if I put salt, sugar, and herbs and an onion, it's now ultra processed. I mean, that's how nuts it is. So I think what we want to do is really focus on all of the research that was done showing the benefits of breads and cereals and grains has been done with processed food because that's the way we eat it. And there is no separate category for ultra processed and unprocessed. With the Australians, we did the equivalent of the NHANES database. And we went through, and if you took out all the ultra processed grains, people were just like the no grain group. They were going to be low in iodine, folate, iron, and the B vitamins. We knew that, but we went and showed using modeling, you would have to stop eating all bread and eat only oatmeal and quinoa and brown rice as your grain products. That's such a Herculean dietary shift, it would never happen. So we've really shown that using ultra processed in this way is not helpful. And we did it with the Aussie database. I hope we do it with the NHANES database here.
It seems like there's really little that these manufacturers can do from a bread making standpoint. And there are a lot of ingredients they shouldn't want to remove or shouldn't be removed in general. So I think it all comes down to really educating consumers and their marketing to just try to educate them on, why is this ingredient here? Like, why do we put salt? Why is this bread fortified? Partnering with health professionals like dietitians for these marketing materials. And I really think that's the best route for them.
If I were a bread manufacturer, I would, and I did this to a speech I gave at the Dietetics Association. If there was sorbic acid in it, what is sorbic acid? Sorbic acid is from the rowan berry. The rowan berry is eaten in a number of cultures. Benzoic acid comes from cranberries. Cranberries have so much benzoic acid that if the FDA had to allow you to label it, it wouldn't be able to be sold. So you can go through each of the things that increases the shelf life of bread and show that they are extracted from natural products. And that while the chemical name is what is on the label, they needn't be frightened of the chemical name. If you lived in Poland, you drank a rowan berry liqueur and you ate rowan berry tea and you had rowan berry jam, or in England. So these are things people eat. So it's not something that's foreign or whatever.
Right. And that's getting into a myth we didn't attack, the clean label situation and how subjective that is, because there are chemical sounding words that are still clean label, and consumers need to be educated on, like, they need a vocabulary lesson.
I think it was very smart. I mean, when I was answering letters in the Minneapolis Star Tribune, someone wrote and asked, why are they putting hydrochloric acid in my food? And I thought, how did anyone get that idea? And then I looked at, they were putting thiamine hydrochloride as the form of thiamine they were adding to breads and cereals. So not knowing that thiamine hydrochloride was not hydrochloric acid. So they had this little bit of knowledge, and that's one of the problems, is that we talk in a science sphere and that's scary to them, and they have little bit of knowledge and they know that hydrochloric acid is dangerous, so you don't want it in your food. And that's hard.
Okay. So just any last thoughts on when we look at sodium and we look at this idea of ultra processed, any final thoughts on what bakers can do again to communicate with consumers when it's something that they can't formulate around? How can they communicate to their end users that despite sodium and despite the fact that it is made on a production line, this can still be a healthy food?
I think partnering with health professionals, dietitians, especially those with a presence and those who, understand research and often share research can definitely help.
I think that just like I said, additives aren't additives. If we could think of why we process food, which Charlotte very eloquently talked about, and what would happen if we didn't process food. We know that in African countries where they don't process food, half of the food never makes it from the farm to the home. And so just some way to, yes, this is processed and this is why, if that could be written in a consumer friendly way, or just really focusing on, well, all the data that says that bread is good comes from using processed food. So this kind of doesn't make sense, does it?
And to add to that, sustainability and reducing food waste are so big right now. And consumers just don't seem to understand that that means, processing foods. So yeah, trying to educate on that. And I don't know that that burden falls on the shoulders of the bread industry, but integrating some of that messaging into their marketing could be helpful.
It's funny that the people who don't want processed food, who are soldiers of that ilk, they're the ones that are choosing things like the milks made out of oats and almonds, and which are very processed. I'm not necessarily against those foods, but they have this. I don't know. They have two parts of their brain that aren't functioning in the same way.
Right, right. And that's kind of what I was thinking. It's that consumers have this very, I guess, linear way of thinking in lanes. They don't look at how it all intersects. Like processed foods are bad if we're talking about bread, but processed foods aren't bad if we're talking about oat milk. There needs to be some sort of educational crossover to help consumers understand that because bread was made at scale, it's not bad for them.
If we all made bread at home, how much of your day would it take? And then does it cost less or does it cost more? I mean, we're not buying 50 pounds of flour at once. And the reality of actually doing it, and then the idealizing of minimally processed food and not telling people that, okay, if you deep fry the chicken at home, it's not any better for you than if you eat the deep fried chicken out. I mean, they don't make those kind of statements. So it's really, really troubling.
Yeah. Well, I just encourage you both to just keep up the great work of getting the education and the information out there. Thank you for the work that you do with the Grain Foods Foundation to help with this messaging and help bakers and baked goods brands continue to provide good food. I appreciate all the work that you do. And that really concludes this week's conversation. And next week, I'm very excited because we get to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's sandwiches. We are going to really dive into how bakers can break through the bread myths through sandwich innovation. And the Grain Foods Foundation is doing a lot of work here, and it's really interesting. And sandwiches make me very happy. So I'm excited for next week's conversation.
Excited as well.
All right, I will see you both next week.
Thanks, Joanie.
Thank you for listening to Troubleshooting Innovation. And a special thanks to our sponsor, Lallemand Baking. Delivering solutions to bakers across the globe, Lallemand Baking is raising baking standards.